Good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. It's both an honour and a privilege to be speaking as part of the Western Front Association's evening podcast series. As David said, the subject of my presentation is the Battle of Cambrai, which of course was launched by the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, on the Western Front on the 20th of November 1917. I think it's fair to say that although it doesn't quite share the same legendary status as, say, the battles of the Somme and Third Ypres, within the annals of military history, the Battle of Cambrai occupies a unique place. As the BEF's final offensive of 1917, Cambrai marked a significant departure from the operations that had preceded it, heralding methods which were, in the Tank Corps Chief of Staff JFC Fuller's words, destined to revolutionize the entire theory and practice of land warfare. Now, the battle is usually remembered for three things: tanks, church bells, and stormtroops. Now, Cambrai witnessed the first mass use of tanks employed by the British on the Western Front, 476 in all, which, when combined with the silent registration of the artillery, thus allowing the element of surprise to return to the battlefield, resulted in both the German Hindenburg Line and its support line defences being penetrated in most places to a depth of 4 to 5 miles. Now, the success of this first day of the battle famously caused church bells to be rung in celebration back in Britain. But of course, it was to prove somewhat premature. The German counterattack on the 30th of November not only retook most of the ground the British had gained, but also prefigured the tactics that would give the German army considerable success during the spring offensives of 1918, most notably in their use of infantry stormtroops. It's therefore not surprising that these three factors have made Cambrai a hot topic of debate amongst historians. In the immediate post-war period, Cambrai was seized upon by those such as JFC Fuller and, of course, Basil Liddell Hart, who sought to criticise the British High Command's attritional methods by pointing out the virtues of the Cambrai offensive. Most famously, of course, Winston Churchill offered this view: accusing as I do, without exception, all the great Allied offensives of 1915, 1916, and 1917 as needless and wrongly conceived operations of infinite cost, I am bound to reply to the question, what else could be done? And I answer it, pointing to the Battle of Cambrai. This could have been done. This in many variants, this in larger and better forms ought to have been done, and would have been done if only the generals had not been so content to fight machine gun bullets with the breasts of gallant men and think that that was waging war. Now, as a result of these early writers, an interpretation of Cambrai emerged, which has not only formed the basis of the subsequent historical debate, but has continued to exert a powerful hold upon the popular understanding of the battle. Three key issues stand out. First, perhaps most significantly, Cambrai has been seen and continues to be viewed by and large as a tank battle. Secondly, is the notion that the opening day of the Cambrai offensive was an unqualified success for the British, as this sort of punch cartoon neatly demonstrates. Third and finally, there is the idea, as Churchill alluded, that the war could have been won much sooner and with far fewer casualties had the British High Command devoted more money, more energy, more resources into developing and employing tanks earlier. Now is not the time to go into detailed discussion with regards to each of these, but it's sufficient to state that all three charges have been the subject of intense historical scrutiny over the past 20 to 30 years, and a number of historians, amongst them Tim Travers, Gary Sheffield, Bryn Hammond, and Alaric Searle have successfully challenged and indeed overturned them. In light of the enormous attention it's generated, therefore, one could be forgiven for thinking that there really isn't anything about the Battle of Cambrai that hasn't already come under detailed analysis. However, I'm going to try to do my best this evening to cast new light on Cambrai, to show that there is more to the battle than just tanks, church bells, and stormtroops, by examining the battle through the lens of the BEF's communications system. Now, for the most part, history has overlooked the signal as war. And this is somewhat surprising given the unique communication circumstances faced by all the armies during the conflict and the huge impact it had upon the nature of the fighting. Looking back at his experiences as a liaison officer during the war, for example, Major General Sir Edward Spears likened the BEF to, and I quote, a giant with a quick and brilliant brain, but whose nervous system is slow, lethargic, and inadequate. Something goes wrong with one of his distant limbs. Hours pass before he registers it. Once he has done so, a counter move is rapidly devised, but transmission is again slow, and before his arm or leg can receive and obey it, it may have been gnawed to the bone. Spears' analogy neatly encapsulates the difficulties that tenuous communications posed for British commanders on the Western Front during the First World War, as they struggled to exercise efficient command and control over their troops during the heat of battle. Indeed, this was one of the principal findings of the Committee on the Lessons of the Great War in October 1932, when highlighting the inherent difficulty that the BEF had in attempting to convert a break-in into a breakthrough. Telephone and telegraph lines were routinely cut by enemy artillery fire. Wireless, or radio as we now call it, was both rudimentary and extremely fragile, whilst visual signalling and message carriers were slow, dangerous, and unreliable means of conveying information. At the battles of Neuve-Chapelle and at Loos in 1915, and on the Somme in 1916, the report concluded, once the battle was joined, the higher commands ceased to influence it. In the absence of the smooth and rapid transfer of accurate information, vital decisions such as committing reserves were often made too late or not at all. Consequently, the momentum of the attack soon ground to a halt as opportunities to exploit any initial successes were lost and the Germans given ample time to call up their reserves and reinforce their defences. The 1932 report concluded that without communication, command cannot function. It can neither receive information nor get out its orders. The army is then fighting without a brain, or worse still, with a disordered brain which acts regardless of reality. Consequently, the end result for many of the British Army's battles during the First World War, as identified at a staff conference in January 1933, had been confusion, huge casualties, and failure. Now, it's important to note that these communications experiences were not unique to the British. All the armies of the era laboured under the technical limitations of the communications technology, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Now, though communications adversely affected the BEF's military performance, undoubtedly contributing to the prolongation of trench stalemate between 1915 and 1917, they were also a precondition for the successes of 1918. Now, this point has not been sufficiently emphasised enough by historians, who've instead preferred to focus on the exploits of the more, shall we say, lethal elements of the BEF's combined arms system, particularly during the so-called 100 Days campaign of August to November 1918. Now, the research that I've undertaken over the course of the last 12 to 15 years, shameless plug, I apologise, suggests that It was communications that held these lethal elements together. Although far from perfect, communications were nonetheless critical in enabling British commanders to coordinate the movement of their forces in semi-mobile operations. By 1918, not only was the BEF generally more proficient in the art of waging modern warfare, but it also possessed a more robust, flexible, and sophisticated communications system capable of supporting these advances. Thus, in many respects, I would argue that communications acted as a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the technical shortcomings and the vulnerabilities of the various means of communication employed undermined the BEF's attempts at achieving a high level of tactical mobility and operational tempo. Yet, on the other, an improved communication system facilitated the degree of inter-arm cooperation that played an important part in enabling the BEF to defeat the German army in the summer and autumn of 1918. So where does the Battle of Cambrai fit into all of this, I hear you ask? Well, in many respects, not only did communications profoundly influence the conduct and outcome of the Battle of Cambrai, but Cambrai itself represented a very important stepping stone in the ongoing development of the BEF's communications system. As I will attempt to argue, the novel characteristics of the battle resulted in a number of significant changes to the BEF's approach to communications, which in turn provided important lessons with which the BEF would develop a template for its communications practice during the summer and autumn of 1918. In short, if one is to understand the BEF's successes in the summer and autumn of 1918, then one must take a closer look at the experiences of Cambrai. What I propose to do, therefore, is the following. First, I think there's need for some useful and important context, both in terms of understanding the BEF's communications experiences prior to Cambrai, and also understanding the principal background of the operation, its aims and its objectives. Second, I want to look more specifically at preparations for the battle. How unique were they from a communications perspective? How thorough were they? Third, I want to assess the performance of communications during the battle and the extent to which they influenced the nature and outcome of the fighting. And then fourth and finally, I want to look at the post-Cambrai situation, the chief lessons learned and what this tells us, not only about the BEF's communication system, but also about the BEF, the British Army, as an institution. So, where to begin? Well, I think it would be useful if I was to begin by sort of bringing everybody sort of up to speed with the ins and outs of the BEF's communication system as it existed on the eve of the Battle of Cambrai. Who is doing the communicating, and what means of communication did they have at their disposal? Well, throughout the war, the organisation chiefly responsible for providing and maintaining the BEF's communications needs was the Signal Service. The Signal Service had been established in 1912 as a branch of the Royal Engineers. The Royal Corps of Signals, of course, would not be created until after the war. Aptly described by Sir Douglas Haig as the nervous system to the whole vast organism of our army, the Signal Service numbered just 2,400 officers and men in 1914, but it grew to a force consisting of nearly 42,000 at the signing of the armistice. Now, it was in charge of all communications, from the bases on the Channel coast right the way down to battalion headquarters. Communications forward of battalion headquarters were the responsibility of the regimental signallers. Artillery communications, I would add, also came under the Signal Service's official jurisdiction in the winter of 1916-17. Now, the officer in charge of overseeing the Signal Service's activities was the Director of Army Signals. And throughout the war, this post was held by the individual you can see there on the top left of your screen, Colonel, later Lieutenant General Sir John Fowler. Now, Fowler was an experienced officer. He had received a commission into the RE Telegraph Battalion in 1889. He had seen service in India during the 1890s and had completed the Staff College course at Cambrai in 1899. He had served as the Director of Telegraphs during the Boer War and was Commandant of the Army Signal School at Aldershot when war broke out in 1914. He was, in almost every respect, the right man for the right job. Now, Fowler's immediate subordinates within the Signal Service's chain of command were the Deputy Directors, the DD Signals, and the Assistant Directors, or the AD Signals, of Army and Corps, respectively. Now, the signal unit of every formation, down to but not including battalion headquarters, was commanded by a Signal Service officer. The Signal Service's most forward representative was the Brigade Signalling Officer, who commanded one of the 4 sections that comprised the Divisional Signal Company. Now, his task was to provide and maintain communications between neighbouring brigades and between brigade and battalion headquarters. And this is where his, and thus the Signal Service's, official jurisdiction ended. Now, at the battalion level, in 1914, the battalion signal section was made up of a sergeant and 16 men, typically under the nominal supervision of the battalion adjutant. Some more fortunate battalions managed to retain a signal officer, though such a position had been abolished before the war and wasn't officially reinstated until 1917. Now, to cut a long and very complicated story short, as the war went on, casualties to battalion signallers and the huge expansion and diversification of the signallers' roles, methods, and responsibilities meant that gradually the Signal Service was required to step in and gain far greater control and direction over communications right up to the frontline trenches, though this was never formally acknowledged by the Army, largely due to concerns over practicality and economy. Finally, I would add that the Signal Service also had responsibility for the provision and maintenance of the ground communication system of the Royal Flying Corps, while in the summer of 1917, 3 tank brigade signal companies, each consisting of a mixture of tank and signal service personnel, were formed in order to facilitate communications within the tank corps. So, what we have upon the eve of the Battle of Cambrai is a very large and increasingly complex communications organisation, but one, I would argue, of growing proficiency and sophistication, capable of meeting the insatiable needs of the Army. So what are the means of communication at their disposal? Well, according to Field Service Regulations, Part 1, 1909, it was of the utmost importance that there existed a constant maintenance of communication between the various parts of an army. To this end, the efficiency of the BEF's communication system depended upon the careful coordination and economical employment of the several means of intercommunication available. In attempting to find a solution to the problem of maintaining real-time communications during the heat of battle, the BEF was forced to utilize a diverse and sometimes innovative array of communication methods, ranging from the most modern, such as electric telegraphy, telephony, and wireless, to the more antiquated, such as visual signaling, carrier pigeons, and runners. The experiences of the Somme in 1916 had resulted in the publication in March 1917 of SS-148, Forward Intercommunication in Battle, the BEF's first authoritative doctrine manual, if you want to call it that, devoted entirely to communications. Now, the overall objective of the manual was to ensure that an efficient system of forward communication existed so as to get information back and disseminate it, to get orders forward and to ensure the cooperation of all arms and units, especially between the infantry and the artillery. Now, SS-148 lay out the various means of communications available. Besides utilising an array of message carriers, including runners, motorcycle dispatch riders, messenger dogs, and carrier pigeons, and employing a range of visual signalling methods, such as heliograph, semaphore, and electric lamps, the mainstay of the BEF's communication system revolved around three more modern means of communication: telegraphy, telephony, and wireless. Now, by the outbreak of the First World War, the telegraph had firmly established itself as a standard method of communication within the army. The army utilised two types of line: airline and cable. Now, airline referred to bare wire fixed to poles, buildings, or trees, while cable consisted of gutta percha or rubber insulated wire laid along the ground. Airline was the prominent feature of the telegraph and the telephone system to the rear of divisional headquarters, beyond the range of enemy artillery fire. Lines forward of divisional headquarters were laid on short poles or stakes along the sides or bottom of trenches, or simply laid along the ground. Now, the closer to the front line, the more susceptible to faults and breakages from enemy shell fire these lines became, not to mention their vulnerability to enemy interception. Throughout the war, the BEF implemented numerous measures to combat these problems, including twisting the cable to reduce electromagnetic leakage, duplicating the number of lines laid, and burying them to ever greater depths to protect them from shell fire. Now, by the start of the Somme offensive in July 1916, all lines up to battalion headquarters were laid to a depth of 6 feet. Now, in contrast to telegraph, upon the outbreak of the war, British commanders had yet to fully appreciate the significant potential of the telephone. With the onset of trench stalemate in late 1914, however, the telephone very quickly became the Army's principal means of communication. As a former brigade staff captain wrote after the war, and I quote, "A telephone wire was not only the outward sign of command, but the lifeblood of its existence. A general without a telephone was to all practical purposes impotent, a lay figure dressed in uniform, deprived of eyes, arms, and ears." Now, although the telephone quickly became the Army's most indispensable method of communication, its use was not without its drawbacks. Like the telegraph, its lines were extremely vulnerable to shell fire and to enemy interception. It was also ill-suited to the conditions of mobility and manoeuvre which characterized the operations of 1918. Furthermore, while there was practically no limit to the operational range of the telegraph, telephones in the early 20th century suffered from the problem of attenuation, that is, the decline in sound quality over distance. The static nature of the fighting on the Western Front resulted in the development of an equally static, though increasingly elaborate, telecommunications network. Now, this served the needs of the Army relatively well, so long as trench stalemate prevailed. Once troops clambered out of their trenches and ventured out into no man's land and beyond, however, telephones and telegraph became a liability. British commanders began experimenting with an alternative and potentially more flexible means of communication: wireless. Now, wireless technology was very much in its infancy in 1914, as these photographs illustrate. Like the early versions of computers and mobile telephones, wireless sets in the early 20th century were large, heavy, and unreliable. With the transmission of human speech over radio waves, radio telephony, at an early experimental stage, the wireless sets employed by the British Army during the war were almost exclusively Morse operated, with crystals or magnetized tape detection for receivers, and arc or spark gap radiation for transmission. What this meant is that they were easily susceptible to damage, their operational range was limited, and channel selection very poor. Now, only a limited number of sets could be employed on a given frontage without risk of mutual interference, and no portable man-carried set existed for army purposes at the beginning of the war. Now, three main wireless sets were in use by the British Army at the beginning of the war: the motor lorry set, the wagon set, and the pack set, which are the three that you have in front of you there. Now, powered by a 1.5 kilowatt engine and comprising two 70-foot masts, the motor lorry set was, well, as the name suggests, it was a wireless set carried within the confines of a lorry. It had a range of approximately 100 miles. Now, as one signal officer complained after the war, the set made such a terrible noise that you could often read the signals better with the headphones off, standing outside the lorry. Wagon sets were also similarly powered, weighed over a ton, and were equipped with an 80-foot mast, all drawn by 4 horses. Pack sets, which you see in the middle of your screen there, were lighter and more mobile, though 4 horses were still required to carry the transmitter, the receiver, the engine, 2 30-foot masts. It took between 15 and 20 minutes to set up and had a range of approximately 30 miles. Now, in light of their size, weight, and technical shortcomings, only GHQ and the cavalry were furnished with wireless upon the outbreak of war. Now, in mid-1915, GHQ began looking at the possibility of developing lighter, portable wireless sets for use in the field. By the spring of 1917, the Army had developed and was employing 3 types of wireless apparatus: the British Field or the BF trench set, the Loop set, and the Wilson set. Now, the BF trench set, first introduced in 1916, had a range of approximately 4,000 yards, possessed a conspicuous 12-foot aerial, and required 6 men to carry it and all of its paraphernalia. You can see it on the left of your screen there. The Loop set, which entered service in 1917, was lighter, and its aerial was much less conspicuous. However, its range was limited to between 2,000 and 3,000 yards, and its band of operating frequencies was so narrow that mutual interference prevented the set from being employed on a large scale. And you can see photographs of a demonstration of the set there in the middle of the screen. Wilson sets were employed chiefly at Army, Corps, and Division headquarters, mainly to monitor brigade and battalion wireless traffic. And their communication range with the BF trench set ranged from 4 to 10 miles. Now, although these sets added a great deal of flexibility to the British Army's communication system, they all operated according to the principles of spark telegraphy, which meant that in the hostile environment that lay principally beyond brigade headquarters, they were very unselective, easily damaged, and were highly prone to mutual interference and jamming. To overcome these problems, from 1917, the Army began employing continuous wave or CW sets, which relied upon newly developed thermionic valves or vacuum tube amplifiers to generate shorter wavelengths, affording lighter wireless telegraphy sets and a greater range of communication, about 6,000 yards, for much less power expenditure. Although the Germans never employed continuous wave during the war, the limited number of sets available in the British Army in 1718 meant that continuous wave wireless was restricted mainly to the artillery for counter-battery work, to the RAF, and to the tank corps. So, by the start of 1917, British commanders have at their disposal a variety of means of communication, each with their own individual strengths and limitations. None was infallible, and British commanders knew this all too well. hence why they developed a communication system with redundancy as one of its growing features. Essentially, if one method failed, there would always be an alternative in its place. So we have the background, therefore, to the communications part of the story. So what about the Battle of Cambrai itself? Well, in keeping with the attacking disposition of Allied strategy, the BEF launched 4 major offensives in 1917. The Battle of Arras, between the 9th of April and the 15th of May. The Battle of Messines, between the 7th and 14th of June. The Third Battle of Ypres, between the 31st of July and the 10th of November. And finally, the Battle of Cambrai, between the 20th of November and the 7th of December. Now, of these, popular and academic attention is almost invariably focused on the controversial Third Ypres or Passchendaele campaign, which alongside the Somme has become a byword for military incompetence and the supreme embodiment of the supposed futility of the First World War. However, although the offensives of 1917 failed to break the stalemate on the Western Front, a number of historians have argued that these battles did demonstrate the growing tactical and operational sophistication of British fighting methods, most notably at Cambrai with the mass use of tanks. But I suppose to understand and to put Cambrai in its proper context, we need to also be aware of what else was going on at the time, not only in Europe, but around the world. Of course, the French army was still recovering from its mutinies earlier on in the year as a result of the disastrous Nivelle offences. More recently, the Italians had suffered a near crushing defeat at Caporetto when the German army sort of spearheaded an Austro-Hungarian attack that forced the British, the French, and of course the Americans to send much-needed supplies and men, of course. The Russians, as we know, as a result of 2 revolutions, are, to all intents and purposes, out. The Americans, to sort of talk about a bright spot, are in, but are nowhere near up to strength and would not be anywhere near up to strength for the foreseeable future. And then finally, we have, of course, Haig's position as commander-in-chief, potentially under threat due mainly to the outcome and the fallout from the Third Battle of Ypres. So, originally intended as a limited operation, the aims of the Third Army attack at Cambrai were soon expanded into a breakthrough operation, Haig hoping he could finish the year on a high. The plan envisaged an attack between the Saint-Quentin Canal and the Canal du Nord, with the intention of capturing Cambrai itself, an important railhead for the German army. Now, the object, according to Haig, was, and I quote, to break through the enemy's defences by surprise and so to permit the cavalry corps to pass through and operate in open country. Now, as the instructions issued by the commander of 3 Corps, Lieutenant General Sir William Pulteney, to his divisional commanders stressed, secrecy is essential for success, and the most careful precautions regarding it must be taken. What therefore did this entail for communications? Well, firstly, a communication blackout was enforced with regards to the use of telephone and telegraph instruments within 3,500 yards of the front line. Now, this zone was to be kept distinct from the remainder and was not used or connected to the back part of the system until 0 hour. There was to be no discussion of the operations or preparations in connection with it over the telephone, and all telegrams in any way connected with the movement of troops in connection with the operations were to be done in code. All newly arriving Infantry brigades were to have no communication of any sort by wire before zero, instead relying solely upon runners. Second, and more significantly, since surprise was the essence of the offensive, the digging of trenches for an extensive deep buried cable network, which had formed the backbone of the BEF's communication system since the Somme, was completely out of the question. In light of the experiences at 3rd Ypres, any attempt to construct a deep buried cable network at Cambrai would not only put the lives of the digging parties in jeopardy, but more importantly, betray the element of surprise. Instead, a main cable route was still provided in each divisional sector up to the front line, but it was to consist of armoured multi-core cables laid on the ground in the forward area and lead-covered cables slung on poles to the rear. Now, the maintenance of such a system presented an array of difficulties of itself. With regards to the cables laid along the ground in the forward area, suitable cover and camouflage became a necessity. Prior to the 20th of November, ditches, hedges, and existing trenches were all used to provide natural camouflage for ground cables. Now, although these precautions added greatly to the general secrecy of the operation, the ground cables were left highly vulnerable to routine German shelling. Difficulties were also experienced in the maintenance of the poled cable routes in the rear areas. The chief problem here was the damage caused by tanks as they made their way to and from their hiding places and assembly positions. Tanks crushed poles and ripped apart the cable. In an attempt to remedy this predicament, special crossing places like the one you can see there on the top of your picture, where tank paths intersected cable routes, were constructed using poles to lift the lines 15 feet off the ground in order for the tanks to pass safely underneath them. Now, unfortunately, labour constraints meant that not enough of these crossings were built. Moreover, many tank units were simply not provided with information from the signal service pertaining to the exact location of these crossings. Consequently, one of the principal lessons to emerge from the battle was the necessity for much closer liaison between the signal service and the tank corps in future operations. Now, in less than a month, Third Army managed to lay 13,000 miles of wire for the upcoming battle. In most cases, the attacking divisions at Cambrai had to rely upon a system of vulnerable ground and poled cables. Subsequently, as Major General William Douglas Smith, the General Officer commanding 20th Division, instructed his brigade commanders, the arrangements for using wireless, pigeons, visual and runners must be fully understood by all concerned and taken full advantage of. Now, in terms of wireless, as well as Army and Corps directing stations, pack sets for the Cavalry Corps and BF trench sets for the infantry divisions and brigades, wireless tanks were also made available to each division. Indeed, of the 476 tanks massed at Cambrai, 9 were fitted with wireless, that's 1 per tank battalion, and 1 carried telephone cable. Now, the wireless tanks could be used by tank, infantry, and artillery units, carrying converted Wilson Spark transmitters and Mark III receivers, which were to be offloaded and assembled at predetermined sites. However, as a report by the 1st Tank Brigade later noted, quote, "The sets for these operations were only makeshift and exceedingly clumsy, especially in view of the fact that they were taken in fighting tanks." Furthermore, with so many wireless sets operating within close proximity of each other, Third Army's technical wireless instructions warned that a certain amount of interference was going to be inevitable. Finally, in accordance with the general policy of absolute secrecy, no wireless set was to indicate its presence in any way before 0 hour. Now, of the other means of communication, there was an extremely limited supply of carrier pigeons for the upcoming offensives. for reasons I wasn't able to find. Only 16 birds were available per division to be distributed amongst the attacking brigades and battalions. In addition, visual signalling schemes were established on each divisional front. For instance, in order that the 29th Division in 3 Corps Reserve received the earliest possible information regarding the capture of the first objectives, a preliminary system of 6 combined observation and visual signalling stations was set up. Once the attacking 6th and 12th Divisions had captured their objectives, they were to signal back by repeatedly firing a series of red very lights. Now, this signal was to be repeated at each relay post back and transmitted straight to the 29th Divisional Headquarters by every means available. Finally, arrangements were also made for the employment of dispatch riders and runners. The route of the runner relay posts forward of brigade headquarters were marked out with white tape so as not only to facilitate the location of headquarters, but to form useful guiding lines for carrying parties and others going forward. So, what happens? Well, in general, as most of us know, the initial phase of Third Army's attack at Cambrai on the 20th of November was a resounding success. Apart from the difficulties experienced on the front of the 51st Division, both the Hindenburg Line and its support line were penetrated in most places to a depth of 4 to 5 miles. Now, the unprecedented rapidity and depth of this advance created enormous difficulties for command, control, and communication. With communications stretched to breaking point, the attack soon lost momentum over the course of the following days, and the British situation became more and more difficult as German reinforcements began to arrive. The German counterattack retook nearly all of the British gains on the 30th of November, much to the embarrassment of the High Command. Now, from a communications perspective, the Battle of Cambrai presented the BEF with a number of novel challenges. Chief amongst these were the problems created by the speed and depth of the initial advance and the impact of the large number of tanks employed. Although these new challenges were met with varying degrees of success, the experience taught the BEF several important lessons with regards to the conduct of future operations. Now, soon after the attack had begun, the maintenance of telephone communication became highly problematic, since the unusually long lines laid by the signal service caused speech to be very faint and often inaudible. The problem of maintaining telephone and telegraph communication was further exacerbated by the difficulty of supplying attacking units with enough cable. The semi-mobile nature of the offensive and the scarcity and congestion of the forward roads made the supply of signal stores very difficult. To compound matters, the movement of tanks and cavalry did extensive damage to cable. It was generally found that communication was much more successfully maintained when cables were poled rather than simply laid along the ground. However, even when cable was elevated off the ground and poled, the poles chosen on account of lightness for easy transport were very easily broken. They should, it was argued, have been longer to raise the cable even high enough to clear the tanks. Now, several suggestions as to how best to overcome this problem in future operations were provided after the battle. Major General Douglas Smith, for instance, believed that routes for returning tanks should be laid down and marked back to the original front line in order to guide tank commanders away from vulnerable telephone lines. Now, some units resorted to more ingenious methods of maintaining and preserving their cable communications. On the 51st Division's front, for example, the 153rd Brigade made considerable use of German overhead lines on the 21st of November, while the officer commanding the 36th Division Signal Company, a Major Thomas Viggers, opened up telephone communication with the infantry brigades on the 20th of November, utilizing the bed of the Canal du Nord to lay its wires. Now, owing to the damage done to telephone and telegraph cables by the passage of tanks, the conveyance of orders, reports, and other information was subject to long delays, exacerbating efforts to maintain command and control. As Major General Oliver Nugent, the commander of the 36th Ulster Division, informed his wife in a series of letters written during the course of the battle, quote, "Information is hard to get when the fighting is on. Once the orders have been given, there is nothing more one can do but wait for results. I cannot get information as quick as I should like." Indeed, the lack of timely information arriving at the 29th Division's headquarters on the morning of the 20th of November forced its commander, Major General de Lisle, to use his initiative and issue the order for his brigades to move forward much earlier than planned. As de Lisle recollected after the war, quote, "My own orders were to wait until the leading divisions had secured the Hindenburg lines before I moved. But as the capture of the outpost line was not reported to my headquarters for 2 hours after the event, I knew it would be fatal to success if I waited for definite news of the capture of the third objective." Thus, despite its novel characteristics, Cambrai still presented British commanders with the all too familiar difficulties of procuring timely and accurate information once fighting was underway. The situation was also not helped by the fact that the headquarters of formations did not always go to places where communication either existed or could be easily obtained. Major General Braithwaite complained of the delay in the delivery of important orders as a result of the unexpected and unnotified moves of some battalion headquarters. Now, this was particularly the case on the 21st of November, when the tactical situation forced some brigades to move away from the main line system. Now, the frequent and uninformed movements of some brigade and battalion headquarters greatly increased the difficulties of communication and made it impossible for divisional and corps commanders to direct and control the battle. By the end of the first day, many divisional commanders were uncertain as to the exact whereabouts of their attacking troops. The volume of telephone and telegraph communication generated during the course of the battle also added to the difficulties of command and control. The simple and fragile nature of the cable network laid immediately prior to and during the initial period of the attack resulted in corps, divisional, and brigade lines becoming very congested. To give you just one example, the signal office of the 20th Division processed over 2,000 messages per day during the battle, a volume which, according to the war diary, severely taxed the powers of the signal company. Now, in light of this, therefore, to what extent did the alternative methods of communication relieve the pressure on the telephone and telegraph system? Well, the vulnerability and overloading of the cable network at Cambrai forced many commanders to seek alternative means of communication. Wireless was used on a far greater scale than in any previous British offensive. Not only were wireless sets available in greater numbers, but confidence in their use throughout the BEF was at an all-time high. Now, numerous divisions reported very favourable results. For example, the 51st Division Signal Company noted that over 80 messages were sent and received during 3 days working, while the 62nd Division Signal Company recorded that 16 of the 18 messages sent by wireless on the 21st of November were successfully received at the division's headquarters. Now, although the work done by wireless proved invaluable, there were still many instances when wireless communication proved extremely difficult to establish under more mobile conditions. A report by the 1st Tank Brigade, for instance, noted that the use of wireless in fighting tanks proved most unsatisfactory. It cited one occasion when the wireless apparatus was divided between 2 tanks, and one of the tanks invariably broke down, rendering the set completely useless. In another incident, the apparatus was again split between two fighting tanks, but before it could be utilised, one of the tanks was knocked out by enemy shell fire. Now, a faulty wireless set owing to a pole breaking when moving across rough ground was also blamed for the slow transmission of information between the 2nd Cavalry Division and Cavalry Corps headquarters on the afternoon of the 20th of November. Now, overall, in spite of the very favourable results obtained by the more widespread use of wireless, the difficulties of utilising the sets under the more fluid conditions of Cambrai remained far from resolved. The fortunes of visual signalling fared little better. The initial assault on the morning of the 20th of November took place under dull and misty conditions with very little visibility. As a result, visual signalling from ground stations was impossible and very uncertain. Little could be seen from the air. Nevertheless, once the mist cleared, the open nature of the terrain favoured the use of visual communication. Signalling by Lucas lamps in particular was in full use between companies, battalions and infantry brigades, and between forward observation officers, field batteries and artillery brigades. In some sectors, the disorganisation and demoralisation of the enemy made it possible to establish two-way working between visual signal stations safely. Yet the deterioration of the weather during the latter stages of the operation made communication much more problematic. This was aptly demonstrated when the Germans launched their counterattack on the 30th of November. Although the success of the German counterattack has been ascribed to a number of factors, including the command and intelligence failings of the BEF and the innovative use of stormtroop tactics by the Germans, the situation from the British point of view was not helped by the fact that mist and fog obscured the front line infantry's SOS signals for urgent and immediate assistance from the artillery. Finally, in terms of message carriers, pigeons were of limited utility throughout the battle, partly on account of the lack of birds made available, but also on account of the poor weather conditions. It was found that under semi-mobile conditions, the distribution of carrier pigeons was very difficult and required much better careful coordination. The one notable exception, however, was with the 1st Tank Brigade, where it was noted after the battle that although the weather conditions were very adverse, fairly good results were obtained on the first day. From the loft, messages were telephoned to the 1st Brigade headquarters, and a dispatch rider brought in the originals every half hour. Meanwhile, runners performed their usual heroics in front of brigade headquarters, furnishing commanders with invaluable information, although inevitably sustaining very heavy casualties in the process. Overall, the air of secrecy that surrounded the Battle of Cambrai and the unique combination of a massed tank assault and the silent registration of the artillery meant that the nature of the BEF's communication system was fundamentally different than that of the battles that had preceded it. Third Army could not depend upon an elaborate maze of deep-buried cable network, and instead had to make greater use of the alternative means of communication at its disposal. The unprecedented speed and depth of the initial advance created novel challenges, some of which were successfully overcome, while others proved much more problematic. Despite the novelty of the operation, the deterioration of communications following the spectacular successes of the opening day closely adhered to the all too familiar pattern of previous British offensives. Now, because of the breakdown of communications and the stiffening of German resistance, the difficulty of maintaining the momentum of the initial attack resurfaced, and the battle degenerated into a stalemate once again. Significantly, however, the experience of maintaining a communication system under the mobile conditions of the first day provided some very important lessons from which the BEF would develop a template for communications during the summer and autumn of 1918. And this says much, I think, about the BEF's ability to learn and to adapt successfully to the changing nature of the war on the Western Front. So when taking a step back then and looking at Cambrai within the context of the BEF's experiences, what conclusions can be made? Well, it's clear that for communications to perform well and to have a positive influence, three preconditions are necessary. First is meticulous planning and preparation. This included thorough training of signal personnel according to the principles advocated in training manuals, most notably SS148, and the later revised version SS191. And of course, the provision of all available means of communication and the supporting infrastructure, such as a deep buried cable network, and of course, the establishment of things like forward report centres. Second, the support of effective counter-battery fire, neutralising the opposing enemy guns, ensured that communications, particularly cable-based and wireless, survived long enough to facilitate command and control during the critical opening stages of the battle. The third, perhaps most significantly, the operation in question had to be aimed at securing strictly limited objectives, so as not to stretch communications above and beyond their capabilities. Now, when these three prerequisites were met, such as on the opening day of the Battle of Arras and at Messines in June, the communication system played an integral part in the BEF's success. Yet when these preconditions were absent, notably at Arras after the 9th of April, at Ypres in August, and again in October and November, and at Cambrai after the 20th of November, communications invariably broke down, exacerbating efforts to maintain command and control, which inevitably resulted in failure. Thus, I suppose upon first reflection, it would appear that by the end of 1917, communications had not made any significant progress since the Battle of the Somme the previous year. Indeed, despite 3 years of trench warfare, communications forward of battalion headquarters were but little more effective at Cambrai than they had been at the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle all the way back in March 1915. Nevertheless, although significant problems remained, and indeed new dilemmas presented themselves, the BEF's communication system did show signs of being stronger and more flexible and sophisticated at the close of 1917. Improvements in signals practice and organisation had led to a more proficient system of collecting, processing and disseminating information. Invaluable lessons had also been drawn from each battle, and new methods and techniques developed as a result. New technologies, such as continuous wave wireless, had demonstrated their potential and had been incorporated into the communication system by the end of the year. In fact, wireless communication as a whole had grown in terms of its value and its popularity, cementing its place as the most important of the BEF's alternative means of communication. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the battles of 1917 were the first to incorporate the principles laid down in SS148, the BEF's first authoritative communications manual. On the basis of the lessons of 1916, SS148 furnished the Army with a universal set of guidelines governing communication policy, practice, and organisation, demonstrating once again that British commanders had clearly grasped the importance of communications in modern warfare and were actively taking steps to improve the system. The principles advocated in SS148, modified and updated in November as SS191, would serve the BEF well for the remainder of the war. Indeed, if one fasts forward to the summer and autumn of 1918, one can see just how much of British communications practice during this period had been shaped by the experiences of 1917, and in particular, the Battle of Cambrai. The planning behind the Battle of Amiens in August 1918, for example, was modelled upon the Cambrai experience, with its propensity for secrecy, concealment, and surprise. Likewise, building upon the experiences of Cambrai, commanders at all levels in 1918 made extensive use of a much wider variety of means of communication. The coordination of the combined arms battle, involving infantry, artillery, tanks, and aeroplanes, required a flexible and sophisticated communication system, without which the BEF would have simply consisted of a collection of unconnected and therefore relatively useless pieces of equipment. I would argue it's difficult to see how the BEF would have managed to achieve what it did during the 100 days without the support of the communication system it employed, a system that owed a great deal to the lessons learnt at Cambrai in November of 1917. Thank you very much.
Brian, thanks very much indeed. That was tremendous. Thoroughly enjoyed that, and it shone a light into a very under researched aspect. So thanks very much indeed. In the time-honoured manner, there's hundreds of hands going up as a round of applause there for you, Brian. So thanks very much indeed for that. Thoroughly enjoyed that. Question and answer time now. We've got some questions in already, which is tremendous. So the first question I'll ask on behalf of Edwin Muir, who doesn't have a camera working. So Edwin's question is this: please, can you ask, was there any communication between the Royal Flying Corps and ground forces? If so, how was it carried out?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. It's a good question. Yeah, there was indeed a very sophisticated system of communication. Not just for sort of the ground-based units of the Royal Flying Corps and integrating them with the rest of the army, but in terms of air-to-ground communication, yes. Principal methods involved, well, infantry designating their position using a variety of visual signals. Of course, that makes one stand out like a sore thumb. And time and time again, not just at Cambrai but elsewhere, I've read reports of commanders who didn't really understand why infantry didn't make themselves, didn't light up their flares, for instance, at the designated moments to indicate their progress. The obvious reason was, of course, they didn't want to be shot. But you also had the aircraft themselves would use a variety of methods of communication, horns, for instance, to indicate their presence. I mean, the principal purpose of aircraft in the communication role, besides the one to facilitate counter battery fire, was, of course, to be used as contact patrol. They were to act as the eyes, if you like, of the commanders flying over the front lines at designated times, which is when, of course, infantry were to indicate their position, and the pilots would sort of note their position on a map and then fly back to headquarters, and they would either drop that in a streamer in an adjacent field, or as was increasingly the case during the war, they would also relay that information via wireless as well. A very tricky task to try and fly an aircraft, observe, and also control the dots and dashes of the Morse code as well. So yes, there's a variety of methods of communication employed, but as I say, a lot of them do rely upon good weather for them to work efficiently.
Perfect. Thanks very much indeed for that. We'll go to Gordon now.
Thank you, David. Smashing that, Brian. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Very illuminating, very interesting. My question is, listening to what you were saying, were the benefits of wireless and television outweighed by the amount of labour, materials, men, and everything that went into it required just to maintain it and keep it going?
Yes, I suppose you might have argued on one end it was, but I mean it paled in significance to the amount of labour, resources, time that went into the cable communications. Telephone, telegraph. Much more was expended on that than was on sort of on wireless communications during the course of the war. But wireless did. It took the British quite a while to really grasp the significance of radio. And even then, I mean, the communication technology is still requiring another quantum leap, which doesn't get made until the 1920s and 30s, and even in the Second World War, there's major problems with radio communications, as most of us know. But I mean, on the face of it, I think at the end of the day, British commanders realised that they what were the alternatives? Every method of communication was tried and tested. It was put together into a system that was growing in terms of both scale and sophistication. And I think at the end of the day, wireless was seen as being one of, and it did. But by late 1917 into 1918, wireless is seen as the most prominent of the alternative methods of communication. I mean, by the summer and autumn of 1918, you've got wireless sets being employed as far forward as sort of battalion headquarters, which 2 years previous on the Somme would have been unheard of. It would have been, no commander in 1916 would have foreseen radio wireless communication being employed that far forward in that conflict, but it did, and I think it did pay. It did pay off in terms of the amount of time and effort that was invested in it, because ultimately it was one cog within a much bigger system, and it was the system as a whole, I think, that rather than any one method, that sort of stands out as such. So as part of the system, yes, it played a very important part.
Right. Can I ask, who were the leading experts at the time, 1917, 1918, in telecommunications, radio? Were it us or the Americans or the French, Germans?
Yeah, great. I laugh a little bit just because, I mean, some might know, some might not, but I've had an ongoing on and off dispute over the last however many years with a couple of individuals. The Germans don't develop continuous wave wireless. Now, it's continuous wave wireless, which uses vacuum tubes or valves.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's this that enables you to transmit speech. So by the end of the war, by the summer of 1918, the British, the French, the Americans are all experimenting using radio telephony, principally in aircraft. And interestingly, I read captured, transcripts of captured German documents that basically, told their soldiers, if you come across the wreckage of any Allied aircraft, salvage this equipment. They knew we were ahead at this stage of the war in terms of our radio development. Much of it came in conjunction and cooperation with the French, and later the Americans as well. Now, the Americans lead the world in telephone. They're the world leading telephone specialists, and the reason for that is because they incorporated the valves into their transatlantic telephone systems, which basically removed the problem of the weak transmission of speech over long sound distances. So when the Americans come over and they bring their equipment with them, the British and French are absolutely amazed by this, and they very, very quickly get the Americans to sort of build on top of much of their own system as well. But in terms of who's doing the communicating from the British point of view, our specialists are, well, the Marconi Company obviously is one of the principal suppliers of the British Army's wireless equipment. But it's not the only supplier of communication equipment. The General Post Office, the GPO, furnishes not only helps in terms of wireless sets, but in terms of telephone, telegraph, and also crucially personnel. I mean, my research came to the conclusion that about 45% of the Signal Services personnel over the course of the war, officers and men, were recruited from the GPO.
from trained sources that were trained.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's another trait of the British. You know, they and you can probably find examples elsewhere in terms of logistics, in terms of intelligence as well. They simply tap into the expertise that's offered. You know, how can we make this better? Well, let's go to the experts, and that's also one part of the system becoming better as the war goes on.
Right. Well, thank you very much for your answers. Very, very comprehensive. I'll let somebody else have a turn now. Thank you very much. Thanks, David.
Thanks, Gordon. Thanks a lot. Thanks for Gordon's question there. It did actually touch on another question that we had in from Richard Crowe, who asked, how did the German communication network compare to that of the BEF? You've probably touched on that.
No, I can give you a little bit more.
Perfect. Please do.
Yeah. As I said at the beginning of my presentation, there's nobody really has the lead. You know, nobody has a piece of kit that is far in advance of anything else, with the exception of the British, the French, and the American developments of continuous wave towards the back end of the war, which the Germans don't use. But it's not manufactured on such a vast scale, and we don't utilize voice, you know, wireless radio telephony during the course of the war. It's only still in an experimental sort of stage. It's all Morse operated. But the Germans do make the decision earlier than the British to invest more in wireless. And they do this in late 1916. On account of two reasons. Firstly, on account of their experiences at both Verdun and the Somme, where their telephone lines, in some cases, the German telephone lines are buried to about 10 feet deep. And even then, they don't fare very well. So they make the decision to switch to wireless. But the other reason why they decide to invest more in wireless a lot earlier than the British is down to resources, and the fact that the Germans by late 1916 are starting to suffer from scarcity of the kind of metals that you need to create vast swathes of telephone and telegraph line, copper being the most notable example here. So with the lack of the materials to invest in this, they decide, well, let's invest more heavily in radio, in wireless communication, which they do a lot earlier than the British. Now that has positive plus points, but also it has a downside in that it also opens up a whole new sort of vulnerability for Allied intelligence to sort of tap into and to exploit as well. So yeah, there are very strong parallels between all of the communication systems of the belligerents, but the German there are slight differences, and the Germans do invest a lot earlier than the British in radio for those reasons.
Brilliant. Well, thanks very much indeed, Brian. That's tremendous. I'll just pick out a couple of things that people have thrown into the Q&A comments. Andrew Downer has said, not a question, but just a general comment. As a former Royal Signals radio telegraphist, this is hugely interesting in the history of my army trade, and indeed in highlighting preceding history prior to the formation of my corps. And he says, thank you very much for that. And then another point from Brian Pascus, talking about the RFC, question that you answered at the top of the Q&A. Please let Dr. Hall know that my published article, Connecting the Dots and Dashes, Wireless Telegraphy Communication in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, is available in the Canadian Military History Journal online. So that's or may well be of interest. So let's call that a day. We don't have any further questions that have arrived in. I'm very grateful indeed, Brian, for the excellent presentation that you've given us tonight. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, as have hundreds of other WFA members. And just one final round of applause from everybody just to finish off the night is coming in with the raising of hands. So we've got another round of applause there for your efforts tonight, Brian. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Good stuff, and thank you everybody for joining us tonight, and hopefully you'll join us for the second of the month's webinars in a couple of weeks' time, when we're talking about the Germans at Vimy Ridge with Jesse Alexander. So that's later on this month. Brian, thanks very much indeed. Thanks everybody. Good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières.